If you think dirty cops are just something you see in movies or some exaggerated TV drama, buckle up, because the real story of Louis Eppolito makes anything from The Departed or Training Day look like a watered-down bedtime story. This wasn't some rogue officer taking cash under the table or tipping off local drug dealers to avoid busts. No, this was a full-blown, badge-carrying, city-issued police detective who literally killed people for the Mafia. He didn't just look the other way, he was the muscle, a hitman, a cold-blooded assassin who used his position as a cop to carry out mob hits, all while collecting a paycheck from the government. And while this happened in New York, the ripple effects of his case were felt across the country, especially in cities like Los Angeles, where the ties between law enforcement and organized crime have always had this creepy, shadowy overlap. The idea that someone could work for both the law and the mob wasn't just a plot twist, it was real life. Now here's where things start getting really wild. Eppolito wasn't some street cop with a chip on his shoulder. He was actually a decorated NYPD detective, someone who was praised for being tough, efficient, and effective. He was the kind of guy who got media coverage for making big arrests and had a reputation as a no-nonsense cop who got results. But what people didn't know, at least not at first, was that his whole life was entangled with the mob. His father, Ralph Eppolito, was a made man in the Gambino crime family, and his uncle was a soldier too. This guy wasn't just connected, he was born into it. It's like he came from a family that specialized in wearing two faces, one for the cops and one for the criminals, and that made him the perfect insider. He had the training, the access, the contacts, and the street sense. But more than anything, he had loyalty to something way darker than the badge on his chest. This whole dual identity, the cop and the killer, wasn't just disturbing, it was dangerous in a way that's hard to describe. Because Eppolito had power on both sides of the law. He could investigate you using official police resources and then feed that information to the mob. Or, if they needed someone eliminated, he could do it himself and then show up to the crime scene like he was just doing his job. And he wasn't acting alone either. His partner, Stephen Caracappa, was also NYPD, and the two of them became known as the Mafia cops. Together, they formed this dark little empire inside the police force, doing hits, feeding info, and making sure the Lucchese crime family stayed a step ahead of law enforcement. These guys weren't doing favors, they were full-blown operatives, and when you really sit with that, it makes you start to question everything about how much trust we put into people just because they wear a uniform. And here's the part that's somehow even more messed up. They got away with it for years, like multiple years. They operated right under the NYPD's nose, moving in and out of precincts, shaking hands with brass, getting awards, and nobody caught on. And part of why they got away with it was because no one wanted to believe it. Not their colleagues, not their supervisors, not even the Internal Affairs Division. Because when someone starts pointing fingers and says a decorated detective is working for the Mafia, the first instinct is denial. It sounds crazy. It's easier to believe the whistleblower is lying or bitter or mistaken than to think the guy in uniform is actually moonlighting as a contract killer. That's the SHIELD culture. Protect your own at all costs, even if it means missing the warning signs. And that culture doesn't just exist in New York, it's everywhere, including Los Angeles. Which brings us to LA, because even though Eppolito and Caracappa worked in New York, their story made police departments across the country start looking over their shoulders. LA, in particular, had a reason to be nervous. The LAPD has a long, messy history of corruption and a deep, tangled relationship with organized crime that stretches all the way back to the 1920s. Whether it was vice cops shaking down brothels during Prohibition, or high-ranking officers covering for mob-run casinos in the 40s and 50s, the idea of cops working with criminals in this city isn't far-fetched. It's practically baked into the city's DNA. And when the Mafia cops case blew up, it forced everyone, from East Coast precincts to West Coast divisions, to ask, how much of this is happening right here, right now, and we just don't know it yet? The truth is, LA might not have had a Mafia cop exactly like Eppolito, but the infrastructure, the opportunity has always been there. Mob families like the Chicago outfit and the Genovese family had ties in LA for decades. They ran bookie joints, skimmed money through movie unions, and had their hands in everything from nightclubs to construction contracts. And just like in New York, they needed protection. That protection came in the form of dirty cops. Some who took bribes, some who gave tips, and some who looked the other way when things got messy. It's not hard to imagine someone doing what Eppolito did, just quieter. Maybe they didn't pull the trigger themselves, but they fed the intel. They slowed down investigations. They made things disappear, and that's enough to destroy lives. When the hammer finally came down on Eppolito and Caracappa, it was like peeling back the wallpaper on a haunted house. Suddenly, all the rot underneath was exposed. They were arrested in 2005 in Las Vegas, where they'd retired comfortably, like they were just two regular old cops living out their golden years. But the charges were heavy: racketeering, murder, kidnapping, obstruction of justice. During the trial, the details that came out sounded like fiction: meetings in dark diners, victims ambushed after being tracked using police databases, bodies dumped and staged to look like random crimes. The courtroom heard how they'd used their badges like weapons, not just to kill, but to manipulate the system at every level. And when the guilty verdict finally landed, it didn't feel like justice so much as damage control, a reminder of how long they'd been allowed to operate. Eppolito died in prison in 2019, but what he represents is still very much alive. His story forces us to ask questions that make people uncomfortable, like how many officers have crossed lines and never got caught? How much damage gets done in the dark because nobody wants to believe the person doing it is one of our own? How many unsolved murders, missing cases, or botched investigations were really just well-executed cover-ups by people in uniform? And what happens when loyalty to the badge becomes a shield for criminal behavior? Eppolito wasn't a one-off. He was a symptom of a system that trusts its own too blindly and punishes anyone who dares to ask questions. At the end of the day, this story isn't just about one dirty cop who went too far. It's about the cracks in a system that lets people like him thrive. It's about how silence, loyalty, and power can turn law enforcement into something unrecognizable. And it's a warning that if we're not paying attention, if we're not willing to question even the ones wearing the badge, we might not notice the next Eppolito until it's too late.